Great. How's everybody doing today? Good, I hope. Getting towards the end of the day. You're at a disadvantage here for a couple reasons. I'm a very fast talker in most cases, but I'm very wordy, so I'll try to move through this as quickly as possible and get us through the presentation quickly so you can get on to the rest of the speakers that you have. First off, does anybody know who Bottle Rocket is? Because if one person admits that you do, we can skip a slide and we'll be moving. Perfect. Yeah, we're an app development firm. You may have seen some of our work in the market. And I'm a strategist on the user experience team. Like any good user experience person, I've got to work every story of my life into an experience. So if I drink coffee, you got to go back and kind of frame that through the lens of an experience. And I want to start off with one that I never really thought of as an experience before, but until a couple of years ago I started thinking about it. And it goes back to kindergarten. And it was Storytime. And if you remember Storytime in kindergarten, or when you were a kid, it was there were two things that are really important about it. It's one, that you can actually hear the story, and more importantly, that you can see the pictures. And I was in class one day, and we had all four of the classes in our kindergarten shoved into this classroom, and somehow I got crammed all the way in the back up against the wooden cubbies, between the cubbies and Joe, who always smelled like outside and drank his weight in glue pretty much every week. So it was not a good place to be in. And between me and the teacher, where the story was, all I could see was 70 boy bedhead hair that was really distracting and kept me from being able to see the pictures and hear the teacher. And I got this idea, momentarily, briefly, that I'll stand up so I can see better. I mean, there's nobody behind me, so I stood up, and it worked great for about 2 seconds until the teacher turned and looked at me. And with what I now, every time I see it, I realize that's thinly veiled rage. She asked me, she said, "Greg, would you like to sit down?" And I know that's a question now, but I didn't really pick it up at the time, so I was kind of drunk on the rarefied air of standing above all my huddled classmates, and I just simply said no and shook my head. And at vampire speed, she worked her way from her chair to where I was, picking her way through all the crowd, got to me, grabbed me by the arm, and just kind of deposited me on the floor in a disheveled heap. And I was humiliated, I was embarrassed, and I had no idea what I had done. I consider that a failure of the experience. I had this false expectation about Storytime being awesome, and it was a poorly constructed environment for me to enjoy the story, to either passively or engage with it. And her miscommunication, the inscrutable use of a question as a command, it was completely lost on me as a child. And I was ultimately, as I said, humiliated, frustrated, and embarrassed. It totally killed the moment so much so that 40 years later I'm still talking about it. It must have been have an impact on me. I would consider that an obscene gesture, not so much just because of her reaction to what I did, but the fact that the entire process kind of violated, what we expect and the contract that we have. From when she asked me the question, the flow from when she asked me a question and I didn't understand it was really not a question, to the point later when I realized I did something wrong, what was it? But realizing that I couldn't correct it at that point. So I define it as an obscene gesture. It's anything we do as designers that with an interaction or required behavior that violates the social contract that we have with the user. And it's jolting, it's jarring, it's startling sometimes. It might be a surprise that's not delightful, kind of like mine was. And it might be something that's hidden to the point that it's really frustrating for that user. So it's something that really just hijacks the moment and takes the user out of the context is an obscene gesture. In mobile apps, it might be a complicated gesture that we're forcing on somebody, or it might be something that's hidden and that they need to find, and that they're going to stop and distract them from the experience until they can move on, or they'll quit the app altogether. And so with the rise of interfaces and all these new opportunities we have to work with people and bring them into experiences in different ways, we need to make sure that our choices kind of amplify the experience that we're trying to create, and that we don't alienate and frustrate users in ways that we can avoid. And one of the reasons that's important to us in this room is that, I'll probably talk today about developers and designers, but that doesn't exclude QA and all the other valuable functions that we have. And if you're I'm speaking mostly probably to developers, I think, but I'm also talking to client brands. You're all designers here. If not in title, certainly in the effect that you have on the experiences, and I've heard a couple people discuss that earlier. I believe that a good idea can come from anyone, and that especially in mobile, that as you're working together, everybody's responsible for the experience. So while you have unique and expertise and skills, you being engaged in the process from beginning to end, this is the way that we kind of work the process. Development is with us when we first start working through concepts, all the way through when we launch the app and work on releases. It's all part of the design. So I think you've chosen to do something that's very challenging in being in mobile, so you should think like a designer. You should give yourself that credit because what you're doing is very important to the experiences. People generally don't expect to work too hard in apps. You know this. They're in, they're out, and we should be making their lives easier when we can in most cases, and not making it challenging unless there's a reason for it to be so, like it's a game or some type of learning experience. And when we're thinking about gestures, it includes all the standard things. When I talk about real gestures, the physical gestures, the standard and the non-standard. It's the taps and the swipes that we know of. It's the less used, but still fairly well known, pinching in and out, and the multi-finger swipes in some cases. And it's the underused things that I think of that, like the long press and the shaking, tilting to navigate or enlist other actions on the device, and drawing or highlighting with your finger, which I think has been really liberating for me the past few weeks, actually. And more custom gestures, such as a counterclockwise movement. And if anybody in here has used the paper for iPad app, it's really kind of a fun app that allows you to kind of do some different things and makes it a real cool experience. And it also makes you look like a much better artist than you probably really are. So I would encourage you, if you have any lingering issues of inadequacy in your artistic abilities, get the app and it'll make you feel better for that. There are other inputs too that are increasingly common. We're using voice a lot more, and along with ambient inputs that kind of detect what we're doing and respond to us automatically without the user having to do anything beyond what they're normally doing. So it can be the device is recording your location. And I heard the socialization app, Highlight this year at South by Southwest was a big release and could be creepy, but it also provides some really cool functionality and letting you know all the people around you that might be stalking you and who are close by. But if those aren't handled right, those can turn out poorly too, even the ones that aren't physical interactions that you're having with that, because they can burden the user and interrupt them with things that they really don't need. And probably nobody needs more irrelevant or annoying information streams in their life. Another novel way to use the interface is taking something standard that we've already seen and used, that we're familiar with, and doing it in another way. And I think, and it was mentioned earlier, but I'm going to say it again because I think it's so important. The Clear app has the most, the Path app has the most seductive button in the world. I mean, who cannot look at that and be, just kind of allured by that? And it's UI porn to me. And there are times when and it's not for how the button looks, it's how it acts. And it's it seems simple now and that it's out there that people could have come up with the idea to take something ordinary and make it extraordinary, but they did it, and it's magic. And now that you know that, it's kind of changed the way I think about buttons in many cases too. So I will occasionally just sit there and tap it on and off, and just kind of hypnotically. I feel like Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction with the light switch, just on and off and on and off. To reinterpret the familiar is certainly a valid way to engage users physically and emotionally in the app experience. But how do we excite and disappoint people when we're doing interactions? I think if they amplify the content and the experience, if we make it easier for people to engage with that content, that certainly is a way to delight people. If it makes people feel powerful, if you get this Jedi feel for doing something that you were never able to do, if you had to use a mouse or a keyboard, I think that's valid also as a way to make people delight people. If you help them navigate more quickly and make better choices, that's something that delights people and adds to increased engagement. And if they reliably, or if the gestures are reliable repeatably, because you can do them fairly straightforward and get through it, again, without having to wonder, is this going to act the way I want it to? And it promotes mastery. I think those are things that create delight. Conversely, gestures and interactions that frustrate people, or when they're complicated or clumsy, or they're hard to execute, especially things that slow people down. You know, when people are speeding through, that they just want to get through the process. If they're difficult to remember or require too much training, then if they have to stop and ponder, then we've probably created something that's a little more difficult than we should. It's frustrating if the actions feel bolted on or if they're arbitrary. And frankly, if it's arbitrary, is it really design? And that's not the kind of thinking that we want to bring to the experiences we're creating. If they don't make sense, and I have a big pet peeve about this, both in my office building, and I'm noticing it here too. Like all these doors that have pull handles, when the actual action for that door is pushing out, it's the same in apps. If you have a control that acts one way in one situation, but in the context of how you're intending people to use it, that's really frustrating. And another thing, I don't know why the bathroom doors always have you pull to open to get out. I mean, you ought to be able to kick that door open. Nobody wants to use their hands there. And if there's no feedback, to me, the feedback is one of the most annoying things when you don't have it. And particularly in the devices that we have, if it's an involved gesture or if it's something that's not clear, if you're not getting that feedback from the experience to know that what you've done actually triggered a process, it's very frustrating. So I've got a couple of apps I've been using recently that I keep tapping the button, I wind up closing it or crashing the app altogether. And now people know that some of the apps, even the ones they love, are going to have this level of problem and concern at least occasionally. So they'll tolerate a level of obscenity and everything. You can make mistakes, but just be careful about moving too closely to that line with people and watching where you go. In the past 6 months or so, we've seen some rather notable gesture-centric apps and apps that bring something different to the UI discussion. Clear. And does anybody know, is it the Rechner calculator or Rechner? I'm guessing it's Rechner. Does anybody use that? It's a gesture-based calculator. We can talk about that later if we need to. The path redesign, as I mentioned a little earlier, and the paper for 53 come to mind. And I think that the use and the visibility of these kind of apps is only going to accelerate in the future. So the most wildly popular apps today, though, seem to be, if you look at the top 10 in the App Store, they seem to be games that marry kind of familiar metaphors and interaction ideas that we know and are familiar with, but they match that with physical interaction that's fun and kind of liberating to the experience. And these are all kinds of things that never would have been as popular on a gaming console or on the computer. So if you look at Draw Something and Angry Birds and Fruit Ninja, Cut the Rope, Flick Home Run, all those and many more are things that are unique to the device and work because you're using your fingers to interact with those. So I think we should take a look at games in many of the cases, whether you're building a gaming app or not. Take a look at what they're doing and what's right about the experiences that they're creating and what's transferable to the problem that you're trying to solve. I think as much as anything else, we're choice architects, so the better decisions we can help people make, the better off we're doing in a job, and the more they'll appreciate that. So if we're going to impose some new or secretive gesture that's difficult for the person to use, we have to provide ways to kind of hint at that, and also for people to back out of those if they make a mistake. This was also hinted at in an earlier discussion. I mean, the idea here is that I think hope is not a solution for bad design. So if you've got a kind of a product that's not where you want it to be, adding a gesture to it isn't going to solve it. Gestures kind of complement the design that exists. They can't completely make up for the fact that you've got problems with the app. And I know that a lot of the designs that we work with are constrained by things that are beyond the designers and developers' control. It's content, it's a number of other different issues that we don't have control over. But the idea here is that we can hope less and think, iterate, and move forward more often. When thinking about design, there's often a tension, a push and pull between various priorities. With the UI, you can go absolutist, with no controls whatsoever and a very gesture-centric UI, or you can create something like an experiential mashup that blends the best of both worlds. In simple apps, I think it's easier to go completely without the UI, and Clear is a good example of that. It does one thing. It creates kind of these simple, straightforward lists, and it's really, the fact that there's very little visible UI there is not a hindrance to you using that. It's very quick to learn and easy to identify. In a more complex app that has processes and functions, obviously you're going to have challenges with that and probably need to provide more guidance for the user. So translating zero UI to something that's more complicated would be a little difficult. Throughout our process, we try to think of a number of things. We don't have a set way that we decide what gestures we're going to include and how we're going to incorporate physical interaction in the device. I was talking with Dave from NPR earlier, and we helped build the original iPad app, and I remember our founder, Calvin, talking about that. They didn't even have a device at the time they built that, but they were already thinking about ways that they could use the device and the physicality of that to bring people into it. They knew that the way people interacted with that was going to be different. So the scrolling tape on the NPR app is one of the innovations that they created and came up with it in how to use the interface in a unique way. But some of the things that, and I'm going to break them out into 3 different areas that you can think of and ask questions. Some of these are probably familiar, and I'll try and work through them quicker. The first one is on the app itself. It's a general app. What kind of app are you making? Is it functional? Is it intended to provide utility, or is it more of an entertainment or fun distraction? That type of app. Is it purely informational? Is it social? Are we helping people create content? I mean, I think that can be a really liberating platform for people to be more involved in the content. You want to give them ways to use that multiple ways to engage with the content that they're creating. Is it fun or serious? And is it inspiring, or is it merely distracting? What's the intended life cycle of the app? And I know we've heard a lot of people talk about how quickly people abandon apps today, but I haven't heard any good discussions recently about how long, what's the intended life cycle and what's the expected lifespan of an app anymore. But if you're going to go and really deeply into creating something complicated and complex, this wild and elaborate experience, is it worth the investment for the time that you plan on supporting that app? Impact. The intended gestures simplify and strengthen the UI. Think in terms of the flow here also. I'm not just thinking about any one screen that a user may be looking at. It's ultimately, is it better or is it just different, is a question that you may want to ask yourself too. Does it increase engagement with the content? Can people interact with it directly and manipulate it? And what are the technical limits of what you can allow? And is it worth trying to stretch those to allow people to get closer to that content based on what you're going to do? Scalability. I mean, is it? If it starts to take off, does the UI that you have, is that translatable to a larger population than probably your core audience? And as you get a larger audience, as things tend to take off and scale and grow larger, it's easy to see that you may need more sophisticated processes and other functionality to support that larger user base. So will your interaction model support that, or are you going to have to back out of it in some way? And can you do that, or are you locked in? And finally, in this category, the platform and the related devices. I mean, how do they bring the interactions to life? If you're using a device that has to present an image at 60 frames per second when you're moving it, I mean, how does that affect the reality of that experience for the user? Is it going to look clumsy and chunky, or is it going to kind of flow beautifully and present those warm textures and that perspective that you're hoping for? And also the differences, simply in form factor between the phone and the tablet are worth considering also. The user, obviously, is critically important to the process, and as always, you're going to want to consider the context and the characteristics of that particular user and what their expectations are, and probably their capabilities too, and when they're going to be using it. Discoverability, can they find the controls and figure out how to use them in the sense that you've provided that, or are we providing affordances so that they can identify that in some way? And I think, when I think of affordances and hints and clues, again, I go back to the gaming. If you've ever looked at the Contra Azure app, they do an amazing job of letting you know through these little visual lights with very little instruction how to move through that experience. And it's a fairly sophisticated experience, but it's very easy for you to pick up on quickly, and it's flowing. Adoption and evangelism. Will people use it, and will they use it and use it again, and to the point that they're going to be excited about it enough to tell other people about it? And training. Is there an opportunity to train the user group? And I'm thinking about, we all know that you can have the tutorials and the reference sheets that a lot of the apps have, and that initial enrollment process that you're familiar with when you're signing on to apps for the first time. But I'm thinking here also about maybe an enterprise app where you've got a client, where you've got a controlled group that you may be able to do actual training with. So maybe it's a government agency or a larger corporate client. If you can train that staff to use it, you can take the time to do that. Perhaps your ability to include more sophisticated gestures and experiences is amplified there. And also you have probably an opportunity for ethnographic research with a very tightly closed environment there with a corporate group to explore what's possible. The brand, you're certainly going to want to think about the brand, and I think we're doing a better job in doing that in mobile. The ecosystem, you want to look across all the touch points and figure out and make sure that that app exists and works well within that group. What's the essence and meaning that you might be able to convey through that app is another important characteristic, so find ways to do that physically. I think the ritual of opening a bottle of wine is something that's interesting. You're physically engaging with that. And then differentiation. Are you just doing what's expected and normal with other people, or are you doing something that's new and fresh and that makes sense for that brand, not just following what everybody else is doing? I would suggest, too, that you be forward-leaning and not future-proof. I don't think there's any way you can necessarily future-proof something, but if you're thinking about future interaction paradigms, and anybody who's ever eaten Cheetos and needed to use the phone, or if you've been on a ski lift and wanted to take a picture, you understand that there's limitations to touchscreen devices. They're just not ideal in every situation. In the future, we're going to be doing things different, and we don't necessarily know what that is. I mean, the Google Glasses is an interesting hint, and some other ideas are there, but we don't know for sure. But we should be bringing people to the point where they can make that leap, nudge them along so that they don't have to make that huge leap. And finally, in thinking about our future, I think we have a unique ability to delight people and strengthen their connection, not just to the devices or the content, but to the brand, the people, and the platform in general. If we use the technology intelligently. But we can also alienate and disenfranchise people, so just be mindful of that. I would encourage you to think of interaction gestures and gestures as kind of the poetry of interactive experience. So the same way that a writer may use words and verse to kind of engage people emotionally in the story or what they're trying to communicate. We can think about what our tools are that are available to us to bring people in emotionally, physically, and connect them in that experience. We have visual effects, sound, motion, color, tools on the device like the accelerometer and the camera. Oftentimes it's amazing content or really smart architecture, and metaphors, analogies, and insight that we've gained from the time that we've worked in the field and from our experience with the brand. So that we can bring people into that experience and elevate the moment. I just encourage you to remember that we're all designers and that we create moments. And designing experiences that make life better, more meaningful, more rewarding for people, and perhaps inspire people to do things. I mean, great design really inspires people to take some kind of action. And it may be inspiring a child to stand up just to get a better look at the pictures, or it may encourage her to do something to change the world. And it's an exciting time to be in this business, and I thank you for your time today and the opportunity to share this with you. And thanks for all the work you do, too, and have a great weekend. Cheers.
Excellent.